Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 338. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, November the 18th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Wonderful day here in mid-America. Sunny, chilly, but this is November, okay? So we've had temperatures around here that have touched up into the low 70s the last few days. We've since had a cold front come through, and the temperatures are moderating a bit. We're now going to be sunny and in the upper 50s, still just fine as far as I'm concerned. But a lot of people are losing their mind because they say, well, you know what? This is global warming here. Global warming is terrible. We need to get rid of the gasoline cars and stop this global warming. That's what today's podcast is about. Not global warming, but America's love affair with ice. Now, when I say ice, I'm not talking about the stuff you put into your drink, although we love that. I'm not talking about the federal agents that raid the sweatshops and round up all the Mexicans and send them back. I'm not talking about that ice either. I'm talking about ICE, the internal combustion engine. We love them. We all love them. Even those of you who drive an electric car love the internal combustion engine. And I've said this before, I have nothing against electric cars. I think if you want one, you should buy them. The dirty little secret is most people don't want them. Most people enjoy their gasoline-powered car, their internal combustion engine. I've said that all along, and now the tide is turning. And I'm going to talk about two stories that just ensconce the way that Americans, and I would say Western society as a whole, love the internal combustion engine. The third world, they love them too. And they're going to have them for a long time, mainly because they can't afford the electric engines, okay? But we'll talk about the top of the notch, top of the line pinnacle of the internal combustion engine, Formula One racing, and we'll talk about why the death of the internal combustion engine is nowhere near where we are, or where they say it is, okay? Before that, though, a couple of updates. One of them has to do with Major League Baseball and has to do with our St. Louis Cardinals. Cardinals had a horrible year this year. They finished last for the first time in many, many years. They were just a bad team this year. They were poorly managed. The players didn't perform. The pitching was horrible. A lot of people say they're in for a total rework of the team. It may have started today. The Cardinals have non-tendered the contracts of Dakota Hudson, Juan Yepes, Jake Woodford, and Andrew Knizner. Now, what does non-tendered means? It means these are players under Cardinal control. And the Cardinals have basically said, yeah, well, we don't even want you. We're not even going to offer you a contract for next year. So they're all free agents. In other words, they're giving them away. So what, you say? Well, Dakota Hudson and Jake Woodford are former first-round draft picks. In other words, in the amateur draft, they picked these two guys over everybody else that was available, every other free agent, okay, or every other, not free agent, but every other young man available in the draft. And they've just said, sorry, we don't want you because you're not any good. Why did they not offer him a contract? Why wouldn't they just trade him? Well, they probably couldn't get anything for him, okay? Juan Yepes, he had a flash in the pan a few years ago, but he's only 25 years old, so he could be valuable to somebody else. Andrew Knizner, very good backup catcher, but he'll never be anything more than that. So the Cardinals have released these four players. Two of the four were slated once upon a time to be in the starting rotation, and Andrew Knizner was slated to be the replacement for Yadier Molina once he retired. None of that ever happened, okay? Why is this a big deal? Well, they've gotten rid of these 4 players, which means they now have 4 open roster spots. The way Major League Baseball works is you've got a 40-man roster. You can only hold 40 players on that roster. You can't hold more, which means they're planning on picking up at least 4 additional players really soon. So if you're a Cardinal fan, stay tuned. The last update, or the last thing I want to talk about, is going to be a segue into the essay today of how America loves ice. A Jaguar update. I haven't given you one of these in a long time, but Dad and I have been working on this car for a long time, the Jaguar Mark 7, 1951 Mark 7. We've installed the vents in the car. And I think, what do you mean installed the vents? Dad calls it the air conditioning. Of course, the car doesn't have air conditioning. In 1951, that car didn't come with air conditioning. But there are side vents that you open from below the, as you're driving, from below the dashboard. You pull a lever, a little door opens on the side of the car, and air comes through, okay? These were rotted away, so they were sanded, painted, refit, because every one of the bolts broke off, so I had to recreate the holes and recreate the bolt pattern. And we've put them on one side. We need to put them on the other side. So that's done or in the process of being done. The chrome strips have been cleaned. And, of course, the fasteners that hold the chrome strips onto the side of the car are all rotten. So I've purchased fasteners that now have to be retrofitted so they actually fit. That's how these things work. Even though you buy expensive parts from the guys to restore your car, they never fit. So luckily I have a machine shop, so I can alter these fasteners. So I'm in the process of altering the fasteners so we can put these chrome strips onto the car. The brake pistons, 5 of the brake pistons broke off or were destroyed or stuck into the cylinders, so they had to be rebuilt. I rebuilt those on the lathe and on the mill. Those are done, installed into the cylinders, and ready to install onto the car. So lots of things going on with the car, and we're having a good time doing it. After the podcast, I'll be back working on it again this afternoon. Actually, this morning into this afternoon. Let's get on to our essay today. America loves ice. That's the internal combustion engine, my friends. Arguably the pinnacle of the internal combustion engine, the bellwether, the fastest, the most exciting is Formula One racing. And Formula One racing, once upon a time, was just something kind of a stodgy European thing. Americans had Indy racing, IndyCar racing, which is a whole lot like Formula One. But ever since the Americans bought Formula One, of course, they've jazzed it up. They've made it more popular, and Formula One is more popular than ever. And, of course, every sport has a poster boy. And the poster boy for Formula One racing is a guy named Max Verstappen. He races for Red Bull. And he's just the best out there. Recently, in fact, they had the Japanese Grand Prix. This was actually back in September. But 4 days before the Japanese Grand Prix, this guy, Max Verstappen, who is just the racing guru of the world, the best, maybe the best there's ever been. It's hard to tell. He's so young. But 4 days before the Japanese Grand Prix, he was in the middle of another sponsor obligation because these guys are walking billboards. And how was he getting his kicks? Driving the daylights out of a 40-horsepower Japanese pickup truck. Yeah, Honda makes little pickup trucks. It's just 40 horsepower that they haul stuff to and from different places, which I don't know why they don't sell them here, because I think they'd be very popular, but that's another story for another day. But Max Verstappen is a driver, whether it's in a $7 million or $10 million Formula One car or a little bitty Honda pickup truck. The remarkable part about this is that once Verstappen had explored the limits of this tiny truck, he then started showing other Formula One drivers in attendance how much better he was at driving this car in addition to his Formula One race car. In fact, in every demonstration, the three-time world champion was quicker, sharper, ready to prove that it doesn't matter what he's driving, but with the steering wheel in his hands, he's absolutely the best. Verstappen has been racing since he was 4 years old. That's right, 4. He was 4 when he started racing, okay? He's 26 now, so he's been racing for, let's do the math quick, 18 years? No, 22 years. He's been racing for 22 years. That's unbelievable. In fact, he's become the most dominant driver in the 73-year history of Formula One racing. He recently clinched his 3rd consecutive driver's title, and he's won 2/3 of all Formula One Grand Prix races since 2021. 2/3 of them, he just wins them. Okay. Now, Formula One can't entirely satisfy his urge to race. In fact, Verstappen spends much of his time away from the Formula One circuit racing other opponents on video games, okay? So they call it the e-sport of motor racing, and he's the best in the world on that too, okay? In fact, Red Bull team principal Christian Horner, remember that name, he says Verstappen is just driving and racing all the time, which is fantastic. In other forms of sport, you can train. You can go hit a golf ball. You can go hit a tennis ball. But in Formula One, you can't. Or maybe you can via a video game. Now, Verstappen, who grew up in the Netherlands, hones his skills and satisfies his itch to win from the comfort of his own home in Monaco. Yeah, if you're a Formula One racer, you can afford to live in Monaco. That's where he spent hours recently learning the ins and outs of the new circuit in Las Vegas, which that race is this weekend. Okay. Verstappen was born into motor racing. His father, Jos, was a journeyman Formula One driver and became Max Verstappen's hard-nosed teacher. His mother, Sophie Klumpen, was a champion go-kart driver who once raced against a young British driver named Christian Horner. Remember that name? So that's where Horner was introduced to Verstappen, because he raced against Verstappen's mom in the go-kart circuit. Okay, so he remembered him, got in with the family, and now he's that Verstappen is his driver on his race car team, the Red Bull team. Verstappen's talent, combined with his lifetime preparation, have made him the youngest driver in Formula One history. In fact, he was driving Formula One when he was 17. He's been driving Formula One racing since 2015. 8 years later, he's written himself into the list of all-time greats. Now, if he wins this weekend in Las Vegas, Verstappen would tie Sebastian Vettel for 3rd on the career victories list, leaving him only behind Lewis Hamilton and Michael Schumacher. If he wins this weekend, and he should, he will be 3rd at age 26. Hamilton is still racing, to be fair, but he's in his 30s and he's well past his prime. Michael Schumacher, of course, I think his son races for the Haas team, but Schumacher doesn't race anymore, of course. Verstappen has won 17 of 20 Grand Prix races so far this season. So of the 20 races, Verstappen's won 17 of them. That broke his own record for a single season. He's taken the checkered flag in 42 of 64 races, going back to 2021. In fact, these results have been so predictable that the other 19 car drivers know that they're mostly competing for second place. McLaren's racer Lando Norris said, if Verstappen is leading going into turn number 2, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Turn number 2. And that's one of his chief rivals is saying that, okay? Now, a couple of hours before the Japanese Grand Prix back in September, Verstappen was hanging out quietly in his tiny room behind the pit lane. Many others use these final moments before the noise of the race to go through visualization exercises and a physical warm-up. What does Verstappen do? He generally takes a nap. But this is what he does. He believes that anything else would be counterproductive. Now, the reality of the Formula One business with these screaming $10 million race cars is that Verstappen ends up having to spend more time in photo shoots, promotional events, and all-purpose fan service than he does actually sitting in the car. Now, over the course of the Grand Prix weekend in Japan back in September, he only spent about 4 hours in the cockpit of his RB19 race car. Then he went into that tiny truck demonstration, which he loved. In fact, after that tiny Honda truck demonstration came a dizzying Honda meet and greet with Tokyo in a Tokyo nightclub. Yeah, it was the middle afternoon, but it was still in the nightclub. Fans paid up to $2,000 to sit on a couch next to him for 30 seconds to get an autograph, a photo, and then on to the next one. $2,000 to sit next to the guy and get your photo taken. And he did that for hours at a time. Now, this more confident, more personal Verstappen is a far cry from the kid who came into the sport with a reputation as a hothead. Remember, he was 17. That's a kid, okay? That's a dopey kid. His reputation was somewhat deserved because he was the youngest guy out there. He drove with his elbows out, defended his territory at the edge of legality, and lambasted his engineers over the radio. His perfect command of the English language was evident in many ways of telling the team he thought his car was worthless. Yes, he's Dutch, but he also speaks perfect English. And that is another reason why he's so popular. Before him, the king of Formula One was Lewis Hamilton, who, of course, speaks perfect English because he's from England. Many of these European car drivers, I shouldn't say that. Once upon a time, many of the European car drivers didn't speak the greatest English in the world. If you're going to be on Formula One and a great driver, you've got to speak English because English is the language of the world. Now, Verstappen happily ignored the niceties of that Formula One drivers learned by walking, driving, and they're walking and driving corporate billboards. He was good at doing that, but he treated everybody accordingly. Treated them badly, but then he was a dopey teenager. In fact, everybody inside the Red Bull garage, that's his team, remember, they said that wasn't the case, or didn't even pretend that it wasn't the case. But with experience, he's matured, and although he's not prone to the occasional outburst, he's pretty much in control. Except earlier this year, he finished 7th in Singapore, went to his room, trashed the room, and left without speaking to his team. That's according to a person who was actually there and saw it. Now, here's the thing. Here's the statement. Verstappen isn't the crybaby that he used to be, except for only once this year. But then he's only lost 3 races this year. In one of the 3 times he lost, he threw a hissy fit. So maybe he's matured and maybe he hasn't, okay? He doesn't throw the fits like he used to, but then he wins almost every time out. So you're not going to throw a fit when you win. His style of communication is more productive these days, especially when it comes to telling his engineers precisely how to improve the best car in Formula One. And these race car drivers are that way. Hamilton is that way. When he started losing races, of course, it wasn't because his skills had dwindled. It was because his car was worthless. And that's the way Formula One drivers are. It's not, hey, we need to tweak this. We need to improve that. My cornering can be better. My acceleration can improve. It's my car is worthless. But he doesn't do that so much anymore. And again, is that because he's matured, or is that because he wins almost every race out there? You can't win a race and then tell your engineers that your car is worthless, okay? Now, unlike a lot of drivers, he doesn't waste a lot of time with words, okay? He just goes out there and wins. He doesn't have to try very hard to drive fast, so he has a lot of time to think. Now, what does that mean? Verstappen uses that time, his thinking time, to apply uncanny attention to detail to the rest of the field. Now, he's driving about 200 miles an hour and somehow has the ability to keep an eye on the big screen set up around the circuit to see what the rest of the field is up to. In other words, he can look at the leaderboard while he's driving. He doesn't have to depend on people whispering in his ear on the radio. According to his race engineer, Verstappen occasionally asks about the Ferrari pit stops because over the radio he can hear the red cars having their tires changed in the next box over. So he's concerned about the other racers because he wants to beat them. Verstappen can concern himself with what everyone else is doing because he has nothing left to prove. The serenity around his championship run this season couldn't be more difficult from his first title run. That was back in 2021. And I remember when this happened because that year his battle with Hamilton, who was the king at that time, went down to the final race of the season in Abu Dhabi, where Verstappen was only put in position to win through a late controversial ruling by race officials. In fact, Hamilton's Mercedes team threatened legal action, but once the dust settled, the result stood, and the most stressful season of his life, 2021, Verstappen was a world champion, and he hasn't looked back since. Now, Verstappen has heard all the complaints about his dominance, that his car is too good, that his car is too good. He's made Formula One boring. Now, Formula One's chief executive, Stefano Domenicali, worked for Ferrari during its dynasty back in the 2000s, but he's firmed up making any rule changes to the chagrin of Verstappen. In fact, what Stefano says is, if you have a good forward football player, soccer player, you can't change the dimensions of the goal, which is kind of true. Now, the next meaningful shift in regulations, which would give rival teams their best shot at closing the gap to Red Bull, isn't until 2026. In other words, they're not going to change the rule between now and then. In other words, unless something drastic happens, Verstappen will be dominant until 2026. That's 2 more years. By then, Verstappen, who's signed through 2028 with Red Bull, has hinted that he might even be ready to think about something beyond Formula One. He might want to do something different, which makes sense because after 2028, he will be 26, but he'll be 31, probably past his prime, like Lewis Hamilton. And he might be ready to do something else. He says he might like to try his hand at an endurance event like the 24 Hours of Le Mans or the 24 Hours of Daytona, where the competition is a little bit closer to traditional racing and a little less like Formula One showbiz. Verstappen is also very wary of the direction the sport is going under its American owners, Liberty Media, who took over the series in 2017. But like everything else the Americans touch, their tenure has seen Formula One surge in popularity, partially due, in fact, to the Netflix hit series Drive to Survive and its growing its schedule to a breakpoint. Next year, the calendar features 27 races, including 3 in the U.S., which once upon a time, the U.S. got a race, maybe. Now, next year, there's going to be 3. Now, despite being one of the most successful Gen Z athletes in the world, Verstappen is distinctly old school. He has little interest in fashion, music, or social media. Even the idea of racing in Las Vegas, opposed to Italy or Belgium or even Japan, doesn't sit quite right with him. Quote, "Of course I understand why we go there. I personally, I'm a bigger fan of just traditional tracks like here in Japan. I think we have to really remember what the core of the sport is and why people fall in love with the sport." Max Verstappen, Eurotrash to the end. I did this feature because Formula One is arguably the pinnacle of the internal combustion engine, and it's getting more and more popular all the time. So you think to yourself, okay, Strong, you're saying that the internal combustion engine is not dead. You're saying that electric cars are not taking over like they were supposed to. Is that your opinion, or is that a fact? You've just given an essay on Formula One racing, which some people like, some people hate, many people don't even care about or know about, okay? So that's not going to convince many people because you know what? You know what the laws say, you know what the government says, you know whatever, and everybody's wanting to buy electric cars, right? Not so much. In fact, part 2 of this essay addresses that. In fact, America's relationship with electrical vehicles has lost some spark, and that's being kind. And actually, if it's going to take off, it's going to require a new generation of products to rekindle the romance because people just don't have the money they used to have. What do you mean by that? Electric cars are expensive, friends. And if you think about it, the only reason people bought them is because they got huge tax rebates from the government. Those are about gone. And now nobody's buying electric cars. Sales of all electric models in the U.S. have plateaued around 100,000 a month. And they've been that way for the past year. Inventories are piling up and prices are falling. In fact, the average new EV price was $52,000 in October, which is still about, almost $20,000 higher than the average ICE car. Now, that's down from $65,000 a year ago. A year ago, they were $65,000. Now they're $52,000 because people don't buy them. Supply and demand. If you got inventory, you drop the price to move it. Now, whether or not the adoption of EVs in the U.S. is actually stalling, the jury is out. It's clearly weaker than manufacturers were anticipating. In fact, Ford and GM especially have pushed back investments. Even Tesla chief Elon Musk has hinted on the company's October earnings call that he might slow down production. While the course correction is starker in the U.S., there's similar moves in Europe. In fact, Volkswagen has put a plan to build a fourth battery factory on hold. Elon Musk, he says, yeah, it's because of higher interest rates, which push up the monthly payment, okay? But the wider U.S. car market has been strong, despite the tighter financial, environmental, and average vehicle prices that remain high. So that can't be the full story. Translation, electric car sales are flat to dropping. ICE engine cars, not so much. They're hot. They're growing, okay? Now, the bigger picture is probably the affluent tech industry, the tech guys who fuel the big wave. In other words, the techies who love these cars, they already have them. They've bought them. They drive them. Now, after they've already bought their car, they're not going to buy a second because you don't need two. The next cohort of consumers, they're not so interested. The people like me and you. If they're going to buy these things, the price has to drop, the charging infrastructure has to improve, and the benchmark setting new products have to make a big switch because the only, to me, I've looked at these electric cars and there's cool ones out there. The Tesla Model S, very cool. That big Rivian SUV, very cool. Friends, these cars are over $100,000, okay? That's a lot of money to pay for transportation. The more economical cars like the Chevy Bolt are boring with a capital B, and they're expensive. Toyota, they're actually one of the few manufacturers that said it's boosting its investment recently. However, for the longest time, they had the lowest investment, so their boosting of their investment is relative. It's still a lot lower than all the rest of the major players. Some potential EV buyers may even be waiting for Tesla's refreshed Model 3, which is now available in China and Europe, but not yet here in the U.S. Why? Because when they bring out the new Model 3, Washington says, okay, here's a new car, so you get a $7,500 EV tax credit. So, in other words, they're not buying the expensive car. Uncle Sugar, translation, you have to go ahead and throw money into the kitty so somebody can afford a $100,000 car. Think about that for a minute. Now, starting next year, this rebate will be accessible at the point of sale rather than months later when you fill out your tax reform. In other words, this change could give the EV a market lift next year. In other words, once upon a time, if you bought an EV for $100,000, when it comes tax time, you get a $7,500 rebate. Now, they just take $7,500 off the price. In other words, you get the tax credit immediately, okay? Translation, if you want to sell these cars, Uncle Sugar has to throw in a tax credit. That's what they're saying, and I see it happening. In fact, the only long-term solution is for manufacturers to lower costs through radical engineering. With the exception of Tesla and a few Chinese companies, today's EVs are even more expensive to make than to buy. In other words, except for a couple of Chinese companies and Tesla, every EV that they sell, they lose money. They include thousands of dollars every time they sell a car. Ford, which is unusual in breaking out its EV business, continues to report massive losses on portfolios, including the Mustang Mach-E and the Lightning F-150. Now, Ford hopes to launch a leaner generation of products in 2025. Renault, the French maker, said in an Investor Daily meeting on Wednesday that it would reduce production costs of midsize EVs by 40% over the next 4 or 5 years. That's what they say. And friends, this is easier said than done. Cut the fun as well as the fat, and consumers may just stick with a gasoline car. Because here's what my day job is in manufacturing. I've worked in manufacturing since I was 18 years old, okay? And it's really difficult to build stuff. Actually, that's not true. It's easy to build stuff if you have enough time and enough money and machinery and skilled people. But manufacturing requires you to build stuff quickly, efficiently, high quality, and for the right price. Because if it costs more to build than to sell, you've lost money and you're not going to be in business long. And that's just not the strong man saying this. Question, who's arguably the smartest man in the world who's in manufacturing also? Answer, Elon Musk. And I heard him on a Joe Rogan podcast saying manufacturing is incredibly hard. In fact, manufacturing is the hardest thing that we do, we being his company. And Joe Rogan corrected him, said, wait a minute, you've basically invented the electric car, the Tesla. You've basically or invented this type of American car or electric car, the Tesla. You own SpaceX. You send stuff up to the moon. You do a lot of stuff. And you say just building stuff is the hardest? And Musk says, absolutely. He said, going to space is easy compared to building the ship that goes up to space, because going to space is just a mathematical formula. Manufacturing involves people, a lot of variables, a lot of intangibles you can't see. Manufacturing effectively and for a profit, according to Elon Musk, is the most difficult thing that he does. So translation, if Renault says, we're going to reduce EV costs by 40% over the next 4 or 5 years, how are they going to do that? By 40%? How are they going to do that? Well, make a cheap, boring car. Okay, so if it doesn't cost $100,000, if it only costs $60,000, but it's boring, nobody's going to buy that car. Nobody. Then it comes to how do you charge these cars? Who has more public fast charge stations than anyone in the country, in the United States? Los Angeles County. Now, the Wall Street Journal's Joanna Stern checked out 30 charging stations in her Rivian R1T, which is a very cool car, by the way, and ran into problems with 40% of them. 40% of the fast charging stations in LA, she had problems. Okay? Well, we just need to build more, right? Who's we? Here's my biggest problem with these charging stations. Who builds these fast charging stations? Sure, Tesla has built some for Tesla cars, okay? But for the other cars, the Fords, the GMs, the Rivians, the Fiskars, the Chinese cars that are coming into this market, and they are coming into this market, by the way, the Kias, the government builds them. Now, here's my question. If the answer is the government has to build more charging stations for these EVs to be effective, how many gas stations does the government build? The answer is 0. Then why does the government need to build EV charging stations? Translation, because if the private sector built them and then charged you to charge up your car, an EV would cost just as much as a gasoline engine. Plus, it takes 20 minutes to charge it on a quick charge. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. A whole lot longer than filling up your gas tank at the pump, isn't it? The other problem is the batteries. The basic problems is the metal-rich batteries and electric motors are more expensive than gasoline tanks and engines to replace, particularly for the heavy SUVs. And that's what Americans like. And the pickup trucks, which that's what Americans like. Sure, you could put them in a little 800-pound people mover. Nobody wants that. Not in this country. Not in Europe. Maybe in India, maybe in Vietnam, but not in the Western world. EV running costs are lower, but most consumers only pay attention to fuel efficiency during gasoline price spikes. Oh, and by the way, gasoline is $2.69 down the street from me. It's not expensive. Manufacturers need to assume that the average car buyer won't pay a premium for an EV, because that's the fact. Now, that leaves them trying to reinvent car manufacturing as well as trying to find savings. EVs have fewer moving parts, which then theoretically should make the vehicle assembly easier, faster, and cheaper. In practice, though, Detroit's Big Three, they had a recent battle with the UAW, and it underlined how tough cutting costs would be in a heavily unionized industry. But then some of the biggest problems are with non-union shops like Rivian. They're not in Detroit, they're not union, and they're having more problems than Ford and GM. Now, the industry will work this out in the end because it always does. And here's the deal. Governments with climate targets are forcing to make things work. Now, it will take years and years and years, and they'll burn through an unconscionable amount of money and shareholder capital for these companies to do this. Meanwhile, this is me making a prediction. Meanwhile, don't be surprised if the next generation of EVs cracks under the pressure, making up for all the problems. Translation: ICE-free by 2026? Friends, that's not going to happen. It's just not. Probably not 2036. Probably not 2046. And if you think about it, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, and if you have a problem with this, please give me an email. I'd love to discuss this with you. jamesstrongshow@hotmail.com. The electric car is the same thing as the internal combustion engine, the ICE cars, back around 1920, into the 1920s, okay? And what I mean by that is, once upon a time, people got from point A to point B with horses, horse and buggies, okay? Sure, there were railroads, but I'm talking about how'd you go to the store? How'd you go into town? How'd you get to your friend's house? How did you go to church? You got into the horse and buggy and you went. Along came the automobiles, the machines. And people were hesitant about buying them because they knew the horse and buggy. It was easier. They didn't understand the cars. They didn't understand the ICE cars. But you know what? As they got better, as they improved, as the price dropped, as they became more efficient, as they became more convenient, people thought, you know what? I'm going to dump the horse and buggy and buy a car because it's better. And that's when they started changing from the horse and buggy to the cars, from the hay eaters to the ICE, because it was better. Long term, I think we're going to go to electric engines, electric cars, because there's less moving parts. It's easier to assemble. Once we get the batteries figured out and everything else, it's going to be fine. But for the government to say we're going to do it by this time is ridiculous. What about global warming? Let me share something with you about global warming. Global warming is real. And that's not me being a libtard saying, oh, Strong, you've gone to the dark side. You're a libtard saying global warming is real. No, I'm not. Global warming is real. Why do I say that? Look at the numbers. The temperature is ticking up. It's warmer now, on the average, in every place in the world than it was 20, 30, 50 years ago. That's just a fact. But here's the thing. This is the middle of November. The temperature was in the 70s. We haven't run our furnace for over 2 weeks because we haven't had to. It's warm. Our furnace is gas. It runs on fossil fuels. And because of global warming, we've not fired up that fossil fuel engine called a furnace. Think about that. So maybe global warming is not such a bad deal. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. The main people who hates global warming more than anybody else, the people who say that the sea levels will rise, okay? You know who hates this the most? The people with seaside property. Why? It's going to envelop our house. Okay. Seaside property is worth tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So the idle rich own those properties. They hate global warming because they may lose their property to the ocean, the rising tides, the rising ocean. But you know who loves global warming? The guy who's got the house right behind him. Because if this trend continues, he then will have oceanside property. That's it. We're done. jamesstrongshow@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Share the podcast with your friends. Share the love. I'd love for you to do that. And you can always send me an email just to talk, just to chat, just to let me know how you like the podcast. I do respond to all my emails. Or If you don't get the email, if you don't get the podcast into your email, send me an email, jamesstrongshow@hotmail.com. I will send you a link to the podcast. You can download it at your leisure and listen to it whenever you want to. That's it. I'm done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.